By 2 a.m., not only were the combat engineers of the Combat Engineer Bttn within the 8th Independent Brigade surrounding and destroying a mixed American Army element as well as a armed civilian militia force, but another Combat Engineer Battalion from within the 38th Infantry Brigade of the PLA's 68th Group Army were conducting their own operations as another mixed Army element, along with another element of armed reactionary civilians, were being assaulted by this Combat Engineer Battalion as they had moved in through the area and pursued and closed off any escape for these forces, as the kill box that had been conducted earlier had been a resounding decisive success by the mechanized infantry battalion within this sector moving in, also of the 38th Infantry Brigade of the PLA, and hitting these forces on their flanks with even an element of this very Combat Engineer Battalion, albeit a very small element, one single platoon from one of its 7 combat companies, blocking any means of escape for these forces. The rest of this battalion had advanced into the city and were now essentially cutting off again their means of escape and hitting them exceedingly hard with heavy artillery support from the artillery battalion within the 38th Infantry Brigade, giving them immense fire support from their PLL 66 152mm howitzers, who for their part, by this point in time, have already laid down enormous volumes of fire upon the city itself, as well as doing immense damage to the various defending forces on the battlefield, as massive portions of Waco, as a result of all the artillery fire from the PLL 66 152mm howitzers, the PCL 181 truck-mounted self-propelled howitzers of the 13th Light Armor Brigade within the 288th Light Infantry Division, and even the 122mm PHL-81 multiple launch rocket systems within the 8th Independent Brigade's Artillery Battalion had laid waste to enormous portions of the city and again its defending forces, as the 155mm howitzers of the 13th within the 288th, the 122mm rockets within the 8th, and the 152mm howitzers were not done yet and would have enormous volumes of artillery to continually lay down as the fighting would eventually wrap up on the periphery of the city and lead to the final conflagration to occur in the downtown area between the invasion forces and the remaining American defenders. However, by this early point in the overall invasion and in the Battle of Waco itself, the forces fighting in the southwest quadrant, primarily those within the 38th Infantry Brigade, were still in the process of isolating and destroying the vast majority of the mixed American units, having had fled Fort Hood early on due to the battle unfolding there, sensing it was the time to flee, having lost all their communications and resulting abilities to coordinate, as well as their ISR capabilities from the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes as well as the booting on of electronic warfare assets, which ultimately jammed their redundant communications to begin with in the form of their radio communications. As the fighting elsewhere had taken a turn for the worst, they had fled the area before the Russian forces of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade had been able to catch up to them and surround and destroy them, as they had to battle their way through additional American forces before they could physically reach the 91st Brigade Engineer Battalion, the 4-9 Cav, as well as 2-3 ACR, who had fled the area, along with even a few companies from the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cav Division, on their trek to the north to attempt to link up with the 143rd Infantry Regiment, whom they knew was in the Waco area, as they had been deployed originally to defend the Waco Regional Airport primarily, but possibly also the TC Airport as well. As there were many American defense firms that were located and had sites in Waco, there was a site of L3 that was actually located within the area that the combat engineers of the 38th Infantry Brigade were assaulting, which was actually near the intersection of where the ring road, which was 340/6, as 6 eventually trailed off of this ring road, where 340 and 6 were, where 6 trailed off. 84 also went through this particular area. 84 being the same route that was near the kill box conducted by the Mechanized Infantry Battalion near the Artillery Battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade, as 84 moved into the city towards the northeast, towards the downtown area, whereas the 340 route hooked around in a crescent shape around the city. As the L3 location was just to the south of the intersection, it was being hit heavily by tactical ballistic missiles in the form of DF-11As fired by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade within the PLA's Eastern Theater Command of their Strategic Missile Forces, which was actually a Trojan unit that was stationed in eastern Texas near the Austin area. The DF-11A having more than enough range to hit the Waco area and could actually reach much further than that, as it had an over 400-mile range, nearly 5. As the container-based cruise missiles were now beginning to fire at 2 a.m., both the YJ-18C Chinese container-based supersonic cruise missiles and also the Russian Caliber supersonic container-based cruise missiles called the Club Ks. Many of these missile systems were now airborne, including some which were also targeting the L3 facility, as this was a grouping of buildings in this particular area just to the south of where the highways intersected. 84, of course, being held up by the stilting, and the outer ring road, which was 340/6, was just below the street level in this area, as indicated by the brown right here, as that was an indication of the elevation. As it was below the street level, the bridges that crossed were street bridges in this particular area. The Richland Mall was in this area as well, just here and off map, and this area in particular was a mixed commercial and residential area, although there was some industrial sites in this area as well, such as this particular plant right here with its gate and its fencing around it, adjacent to these 3 rail tracks that ran through the area. And there were gas station here and a hospital just off the map. as well as the site of L3 right in this area here. And these were apartment complexes here. Small businesses, self-storage area, and other small businesses over in this area right here. As the battle map here was essentially a segment of a larger battle unfolding between the Combat Engineer Battalion, the mixed American military forces, who were also accompanied by armed reactionary civilian elements. This particular battlefield, which was a 1.5 by 1 mile area, 1.5 miles east-west by 1 mile north-south, which essentially only is conveying the eastern half of this particular battle that unfolded right in this area, just to the southeast of Lake Waco, where it moves into the south right here. As the artillery strikes were particularly heavy off the map, there were other artillery strikes that had hit this particular area to assist not only in the destruction of the L3 area here, but also because armed reactionary civilians had been spotted on the flanks of the last moving combat company of the combat engineers, as they had their other companies off map, as this was their last company in the eastern direction of their battalion. They had conducted these strikes against armed reactionary civilians whom they'd spotted with both not only their high-altitude ISR assets in the area in the form of their high-altitude recon drones, whether they're CH-4As or their WZ-7 or even higher altitude such as satellites, but also their quadcopter reconnaissance assets operated in the immediate area by these various squads comprising these companies, including this company in this area here. There had been a volley of CH-901A loitering munitions equipped with heat warheads fired by not the headquarters battalion's drone sections of the 38th Infantry Brigade, of whom this Combat Engineer Battalion was a part, but actually from the 8th Independent Brigade's headquarters battalion, as the headquarters battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade had recently begun moving towards and into the Waco Regional Airport, which would take them some time to set up their new command post and assets to be able to launch further volleys of these weapons. As the headquarters battalion of the 8th Independent Brigade was now picking up their slack as they were moving. As the mixed American elements in this particular area were essentially 2 company-sized elements worth of forces, vehicles, and troops, they were fleeing the other combat engineer battalions that had begun to assault them just off the map and to the immediate west, near the hospital that was right off the map. And were trying now to flee the area by moving to the slight north and east to cross the street bridges that went over the State Highway 340/6, which went through the area and was below the street level. Street levels were elevated on either side above the highway. These were the bridges that crossed. This Route 84, this highway here, was essentially the same highway that was in the kill box area where the Mechanized Infantry Battalion in the previous installments had moved into this area and destroyed this mixed element of American Army forces with the assistance of the Artillery Battalion and even a single platoon from one of the 7 combat companies of the Combat Engineers, not counting, of course, its headquarters and support company, as there were 8 companies that comprised the battalion. As in this area, as the artillery strikes at the opening of this map, as this is essentially early on in this fight at the opening of this map that was occurring in this area, the artillery was fired to assist with guarding the flanks of these forces as a sort of mix between a terrain denial operation, a precision strike operation against certain armed combatants out in the field here, as well as also to hit the larger facilities in this area of L3, as they were just to the south of where this intersection was, where this clover leaf is, where these two highways basically connected with the clover leaf. As early on, there are various forces moving around on the map, including not only this DF-11A coming in and striking and hitting the same facility as more of a redundancy after two previous DF-11s had already hit and leveled nearly all the facility, as well as the YJ-18C/Caliber cruise missiles coming in and flying over the area as they were airborne and moving either to targets here or elsewhere off map. The Wing Loong 2 armed combat drones operating in this particular battle segment of the larger Waco Battle out of the 5 that had been deployed to the Waco area, not counting even the CH-4A high-altitude reconnaissance drones, which were armed reconnaissance drones and could actually carry even 4 more air-to-ground weapons than even could the dedicated combat drones of the Wing Loong 2s. As they also had loitering munitions in the area as well, and the Wing Loong 2s were armed with the HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, or also the CM502KGs. And these two particular Wing Loong 2s are firing 4 apiece before veering off, looking for other targets of opportunity to support many of the other unfolding combat situations as they developed, as it was still very early on in the fighting, and these Wing Loong 2s were just firing their first shots, not counting the one that was supporting operations in the north of the city and others elsewhere. As these two each were firing 4 CM502KGs and HJ-10s at their different targets on the map, the highest priority targets for these Wing Loong 2s were a single M1A2 tank that was part of this mixed American element that came from the 49 Cav, that squadron battalion-sized element from 1st Cav, as well as also an M1l1tia mortar track that was firing 81mm mortars off map at other companies that were part of the Combat Engineer Battalion as a whole. And although the Americans lacked any proper ISR network due to the tandem anti-satellite, cyber strikes, and electronic warfare assets being booted on all at midnight, they did their best and tried to walk in their mortar shots the best they could, although they weren't always successful, and this mortar track only got off 1 shot by the time it was hit by a CM502KG dual-purpose anti-armor/anti-ship missile, which completely destroyed this vehicle and the mortar that it was encapsulated within the vehicle. As the CH-901As flying throughout this area were all equipped with heat warheads, that had been done in anticipation of having to hit some of the heavier military vehicles within these mixed American Army units, such as the M1l150 armored engineering vehicles from the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion, one such being right here, adjacent to the M1A2. Of course, the M1A2s, also the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and also even the Stryker Dragoon infantry fighting vehicle version of the Stryker. Although the Stryker Dragoon wasn't nearly as heavily armored as was the Bradley, it was still a vitally important target to eliminate just based upon the weapons that it carried, as it could carry the powerful 30mm autocannon, essentially the same type of caliber that was carried on Chinese and Russian infantry fighting vehicles, although the Chinese and Russian infantry fighting vehicles also had a 100 caliber main gun, which was even more powerful by far than was even the 30, which was very destructive and very potent. As this combat engineer company moved into the area, they're already taking a lot of fire from the dismounted forces of American troops that were trying to guard the flanks of their vehicles, trying to flee the area. They're trying to get out of here and cross the bridges and move into the area just to the north of the ring road, which was 340/6. Also, there were American armed reactionary civilians, not just a larger number off the map and to the west, fighting with a few other mixed American military elements, but also trying to flee on the highways to get the hell out of this area, as it was highly embattled and had already been struck by artillery, as evidenced by all the destroyed buildings in this area and off map, as well as here, damaged building here from a strike here, and increasingly on the other side of the highways, as L3 was being hit by missiles and artillery, as the buildings here were completely turned into rubble and cratered ruination, as the very powerful DF-11As had already made enormous craters and threw rubble in all directions, and this building was about to be hit by cruise missiles and artillery strikes, which would in turn destroy this vehicle full of armed reactionary civilians trying to flee the area, this being a pickup truck / technical, as by technical definition, no pun intended, it was such, as there were armed men in the back with weapons. There were also armed reactionary civilians trying to flee this area through these apartment complexes, passing this apartment building right here, running up the street here, and running through this apartment complex here. Some of them would successfully flee, as indicated by this arrow not encapsulated by red, or this one not encapsulated by red, whereas others would be KIA'd, as this loitering munition strike against this group right here would eliminate this grouping of 7 right here running up the street, as it would impact them as they were trying to cross these railroad track embankments / street right here where the embankments and the road met. And also, there was a group that fled successfully for the time being from this area right here, as indicated by the arrow as they got off map. Although other groups would again not be as fortunate, as indicated, as this group right here was fleeing across the bridge, temporarily stopping here to return fire before moving again around this gas station, as this group would later be assaulted by this squad of PLA troops right here. But before then, there was a lot of fighting going on in this particular area, as this company was moving up this street beneath 84 right here that was on the columns, the support columns. Some of the first moves that occurred were the armored engineering vehicles, the armor personnel carriers, and the infantry fighting vehicles that equipped these platoons comprising the combat elements of this combat engineer company had laid waste to this grouping of armed reactionary civilians in this parking lot, including their vehicle, before dismounting troops and armed robots equipped, these quad-legged robots that were equipped with the W-85 heavy machine guns, outside of the vehicles to guard their side flanks and gradually advance to attempt to cut off any form of escape across the bridges, while the main force of their company that was operating in this area here would hit them from their sides as they moved up these streets, as everything was ISR directed from their quadcopter reconnaissance assets that fed into the AI processing system that processed all the real-time fluid battlefield data and fed it back into the combat data links and advised commanders on the ground how best to deploy weapons and resources, which also in turn cut down on friendly fire incidents. These forces were increasingly ever more destructive and potent as a result of their access to such vital battlefield tools, whereas the Americans' access to any sort of ISR capabilities were completely gone, fully diminished. As early on, the loitering munitions were also a major factor in the fighting in this particular area, as the CH-901As were already moving in and hitting various different targets throughout the battlefield, as indicated as such with the GCZ-112 Armored Combat Engineering Vehicle able to fire its rocket-guided line charge of C4 plastic explosives, being highly devastating to minefields, personnel, vehicles, and other obstacles, with the ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles with their 100mm main gun, 30mm autocannon, which is what's being fired on the other side of the main gun, as well as even having 2 HJ-09 anti-tank missile pods. And then, of course, there were the Type 89A armor personnel carriers that equipped the combat engineers with the loitering munitions, as was being described, supporting them to the hilt while in the field, as these CH-901As, when set on AI targeting mode, as well as the quadcopter ISR assets aiding in feeding back the targeting data for these munitions, as the reconnaissance, surveillance, and intelligence gathering assets, including these quadcopter recon drones, feeding steady streams of data into the AI processing system, would feed back targeting data to these loitering munitions, which would move down and strike their targets with such a degree of accuracy that it was essentially impossible to avoid once these locked onto target, as the forces in the field on the American side had found out since the very beginning minutes of this invasion, as the missiles coming from the Wing Loong 2 combat drones were also highly devastating and were causing immense levels of destruction, as even the volley of 8 that were fired from these two systems before they had veered off in search of other portions of the battlefield to support, they had already hit some of the most vital targets in the battlefield in conjunction with these devastating loitering munitions. As this grouping of vehicles was moving through the area and beginning to turn on this street right here, with others beginning to go up this street, they were being hit by loitering munitions and destroyed, as this one's impacting right here. These two impacting lead vehicles here, which is a Max Pro MRAP LMTV truck. The rest of the surviving vehicles, which was only 3, the fuel truck, Max Pro MRAP, and a Striker infantry carrier version going around being hit, they were destroyed, as well as also ground-based fire coming from the infantry fighting vehicles, W-85 heavy machine guns, and the armored engineering vehicles, GCZ-112s. Not to mention the dismounted troops that were moving through the area and were adding to the pandemonium with their quad-legged robots that were supporting the troops that were hugging these rubble piles and using them to basically fight, firing their barrel-fired grenades in support of their vehicles, who were laying down enormous volleys of fire on their own, with the ZBD-04As, again, firing anti-tank missile pods, as well as their 100mm main guns, 30mm autocannons, and they even possessed a 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine gun into these troops with the dismounts, as this was a whole dismounted platoon, 5 squads with these 5 armed robots, quad-legged robots, moving into the area and laying down heavy fire against these dismounted troops here, as well as those here. Now, though the Americans possessed small arms, of course, well, along with their limited anti-armor capabilities like AT-4s and also a very small handful of anti-tank missiles, they had been wiped out so quickly, they really didn't get much of a chance to use these systems in retaliation or response to the advancing PLA forces by the time they had been seen first and cut down. They already knew where the Americans were. It wasn't a surprise, and the systems they possessed could be targeted accordingly. As, again, these vehicles in this column right here were moving up the street, besides just this column trying to get out of the area and move across the bridge, they were being interdicted and destroyed by loitering munitions, including a fourth right there, ground-based fire from the personnel moving into this area, firing anti-tank missiles like the HJ-08s, as well as the heavy machine gun fire from the armed robots acting as mobile fire support platforms as an extension of the vehicle-based mobile fire support platforms. Because these were smaller and very nimble, they could get into rubble and around it and fire and maneuver with the troops. As these forces held the corners of the rubble piles and used them as basically cover and concealment while they fought from these positions, they had a squad bound across the street as the robots laid down heavy fire and the troops fired anti-tank weapons, including also anti-armor weapons like the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade rounds at these vehicles. At the opening of the map, this Max Pro MRAP at the very end was already destroyed by an anti-tank weapon. This one destroyed by a loitering munition, with the rest of the vehicles that managed to get around being destroyed by these loitering munitions and also ground-based fire, as this squad had advanced into position and was exchanging fire back and forth with these vehicles from around this corner of this rubble pile that used to be a building, while this squad bounded across as they tactically held the corner. They bounded across behind them, and then they held the corner and waited as they fired at these forces trying to cross the bridge, and they waited here until they had gotten across before bounding across tactically in a group with 5 holding this corner while the rest bounded across to the corner, and they held the corner while the rest bounded across, as this was a bit of a bound. While on the street, on the highway, loitering munitions had at the opening hit this technical, trying to speed under these bridges here on this segment of highway 340/6 down here and lower elevated, as this was a entry ramp from the city street above on higher elevation, and this was an exit ramp from the highway to the city street above on higher elevation across this bridge, where this is a gas station here and more. As the forces were now basically in a position where they were increasingly being wiped out bit by bit, the loitering munitions had also gotten these vehicles coming down the highway on Route 340/6 right here. There were 3 of them moving through the different lanes of the highway, although they had to maneuver around abandoned cars increasingly as people were abandoning their cars. It was still very early in the invasion, and many people had taken the opportunity to flee right away, many of the more wise amongst the population, although there were beginning to become vehicles that were abandoned on the highway systems throughout the land. As this vehicle was trying to flee, it was caught up to and destroyed by a loitering munition here. This loitering munition was patrolling the area looking for targets, while this squad had moved into the area right here and taken this corner. They were firing across this bridge area that went over the highway. They were firing across the highway from around where this bridge crosses. They were firing from this corner across the highway at these dismounted troops, a whole squad of troops. Long after these few survivors of this group that had been attacked by them when they were back here had since maneuvered and went around this gas station and small business and then crossed the street, attempting to get out of the area before they were KIA'd by a loitering munition, with them abandoning their position and running into this self-storage place with an artillery strike called in upon them by these forces, as they had witnessed them entering this self-storage place and going into the office that was promptly hit and destroyed by a 152 millimeter shell. Loitering munition strike KIA'd a large grouping of these armed reactionary civilians, with 3 others trying to escape into this area here between this office building for a factory complex and this small business right here going through this alley. They escaped for a time, but it was unlikely that they would last for very long, as loitering munitions also patrolled the mall right here over the mall parking lot. This is the Richland Mall, part of it. They were patrolling over this parking area, this one and this one. This group would be hit by a loitering munition at the opening of the map, as there's, again, as always, many different things occurring at the same time on these maps. Conveying them all in a rational order is always difficult, but as always, it will be attempted. As the combat engineers moved into the area, they had stopped taking fire as they had sat here for a time while all these maneuvers were going on, as the missiles came in and struck, along with artillery, the L3 compound complex that was just south of this highway intersection of 84 and 340/6. While other personnel had been somewhat successful in fleeing, as indicated, including here across the street and the different rail tracks, not everybody would be so successful, as indicated by the artillery strike, the loitering munition strikes hitting all these military vehicles that were crossing the way, along with these HJ-10 and CM502 anti-armor missiles striking these vehicles, along with loitering munition strikes getting the rest, as this whole convoy here of support vehicles was completely annihilated by the time the lead vehicle got to the end of this bridge. These 4 personnel here were cut down completely as well by the fire that occurred from this squad as it went from around this building and crossed the street and got to this corner and laid down heavy fire against both this grouping and this grouping. There was a brief exchange of fire, as indicated by the green on the arrow, as it indicates that this squad had taken some fire, but the return fire they dished out forced them to have to flee for better cover and concealment. And although they had originally wanted to hide out in this office and take cover there until they could come up with something better, the artillery strike that came down on it didn't even give them that chance. And when it was all said and done, as this grouping of a Max Pro MRAP fuel truck and some Strikers, M1l1trias, and Bradleys, which the 2 lead Bradleys were hit by 2 HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, destroying them, with the rest having to be forced to go around them, only to be interdicted by loitering munitions, including this one here, as well as fire, which by this point was coming from down this way, as another additional combat engineer company was moving down this street parallel to the ring road, which was 340/6. The final moves being made on this particular map were, as this combat engineer company stopped here due to blockage in the middle of the street due to the fire they had dished out with their infantry fighting vehicle, even firing over the wreckage at these different vehicles as they had fled the area, only for them to be intercepted by fire coming from the Combat Engineer Company that was now helping to surround the area off map before moving into this portion, which they had their vehicles spaced out in a single line to help with cutting off the retreat, thereby being able to lay fire down this way and across from the highway, from where they were here, firing over the highway. They were to block the escape over the bridges, as well as being able to fire over at anything that had already gotten over there, whether personnel or vehicle. The rest of these forces had by then been completely and totally KIA'd by the loitering munition, ground-based fire, and Wing Loong 2 fire, as well as some artillery strikes that had since occurred. With this battle ending extremely fast, this battle was only a 20-minute long affair from beginning to end, as the fighting that was occurring over by the hospital, which was literally like right off the map here, also wrapping up in the same amount of time. From the time the combat engineers entered the area, from the time all their different comprising companies had made their final moves, as they had guarded their flanks by dismounting troops that steadily moved through this area, from the time that their other company entered this area up here, they had completely surrounded whatever would have even remained of the different mixed American military elements, as well as even some armed reactionary civilian elements, although some had temporarily escaped. True enough, they would not ultimately live very long if they continued to openly resist instead of going into immediate hiding or trying to escape the city to regroup, reorganize, and come up with something much better than what they already had, because what they were doing was not working. And it was not working horrendously, as it was, again, about continuity of resistance. It was not about what they could do in the moment, as what they could do in the moment was highly curtailed and extremely limited due to no actionable intel, from there being no reliable ISR network or capabilities, as that had all been removed. They had no quantifiable superiority in weapons, tactics, or anything else, whereas the PLA had every advantage in every category and was coming in hot with all weapons blazing. What would need to happen would be that the American forces would have to wait for things to settle down after the inevitable PLA victory, so that they could begin to plan and reorganize, regroup, delegate tasks to people that actually had expertise in their various fields and make it count, as well as coming up with new ways of communication and also new ways of prosecuting resistance against a force with all of the advantages that they possessed. As the tactical, ballistic, and cruise missiles hit their marks and destroyed their targets, the very limited American defense industry as it stood was being dismantled bit by bit, piece by piece, as by the first few hours there was no more defense contractors within the Waco battle space, as they had all been essentially annihilated by the combo of artillery and missile strikes, as well as some being simply hit by ground-based fire and being dismantled that way, as it pertained to some of the maneuver elements moving into an area and capturing certain facilities and badly damaging them in the process. As it pertained to this particular instance of combat that unfolded in this particular segment of the city, neither the reactionary armed civilians nor the American mixed military elements from Fort Hood of Mixed Active Duty Army battalion-sized elements and a few company-sized elements from 1st Cav Division's 3rd Brigade that were doing their foot patrol training at the opening of the hostilities in the Fort Hood battle space were able to do much of anything to get to the downtown area of which these forces on this map were trying to achieve to begin with. They were trying to get downtown to link up with the 143rd, who was holding out better than everybody else in the downtown area, and had by this point, with the very few mixed American military elements that had managed to reach them, were beginning to establish the very initial phases of a real coherent defensive line. As the American engineering forces, similar to the PLAs, had their M1l1tia armored engineering vehicles, like the PLA had their GCZ-112, and were able to use their M1l1tias to erect different types of defensive lines using rubble and barricades, and also were helping in the nitty-gritty work of all of the digging that needed to be done, and even planting their limited supply of anti-tank mines and even a small amount of claymore mines they possessed, which originally had the intent, as they were conducting training on Fort Hood, of being demolished using their line charges as they would go out, plant the minefield, and demolish it with a live fire training exercise of using their M1l1tia's rocket line charge to do such. But instead, these mines found a new use, being used within the scope of the battle now unfolding in Waco, as they, instead of being used and destroyed as an example of training on their M1l1tias, these would be repurposed for use as defensive implements in the fighting that would occur in the downtown area, as this is already initiated or already by this point, but would only pick up in terms of overall tempo and intensity level as more and more of the external portions of Waco fell. The pressure would mount on the downtown area and the forces that were contained within it, as more and more of the PLA's battalions would surround the downtown and increasingly put ever more pressure upon it and the defenders holding it, which would ultimately lead to the fall of the city, but the defenders would essentially give it a good go, as it were, as the defenders had heart, but they lacked in everything else, and it was everything else that basically counted in a situation like this. In the next portion of the Waco Battle, the fighting that occurred here was happening just to the north and west of the large grouping of mixed American elements that had entered the city from the south, moving up this way before one of the mechanized infantry battalions, also of the 38th Infantry Brigade, had moved in adjacent to I-35 to close their escape, as they would fight early on against a mixed American element here, sending it along with another moving into the city proper before assaulting them and destroying an even larger grouping as more would move into the area to fight this force. this grouping inadvertently because they would be contacted before this battalion arrived and informed by these other forces of their arrival, and would move back into this area to assist these other forces because they would try to recongregate and move as a larger group into downtown, but would ultimately fail as this battalion would move in and engage and destroy all of them. That will be gone over in the next video installment of the Waco Battle within this hypothetical invasion documentary series on fourth generation warfare doctrines.